The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. 28 years old, with steel-gray eyes and a military bearing that spoke of years in the Welsh Guards, he had dreamed of this posting since joining the army at 18. Standing guard at the Queen's official residence was the pinnacle of ceremonial duty, a role that demanded absolute precision and unwavering discipline. James had earned his place through dedication and skill. Born in a small Welsh mining town where opportunities were scarce, he had joined the military to escape a life underground like his father and grandfather before him. His mother, Margaret, had worried constantly about his decision, but she couldn't argue with the pride that filled her eyes when she saw him in his dress uniform for the first time, the changing of the guard. Ceremony was scheduled for 11:30, and tourists were already gathering behind the ornate iron gates. James could hear the excited chatter in dozens of languages as visitors from around the world positioned themselves for the perfect photograph. This daily spectacle drew thousands of spectators, all hoping to witness the precision and pageantry that had remained unchanged for centuries, standing at attention beside the sentry box. James felt the familiar weight of his bearskin hat and the ceremonial rifle on his shoulder. His black boots gleamed like mirrors, polished to perfection in the early hours of dawn. Every button on his scarlet tunic had been inspected, every piece of equipment checked and rechecked. The guards took pride in their appearance, understanding that they represented not just themselves, but the crown and the entire British military tradition. The crowd beyond the gates grew larger as the ceremony time approached. James could see families with children pressed against the railings, elderly couples sharing binoculars, and young backpackers clutching guidebooks. A group of Japanese tourists had arrived early and claimed prime viewing spots, their cameras already clicking away at the stationary guards. Among the spectators, James noticed a middle-aged American couple struggling with a large tourist map. The woman kept pointing in different directions while her husband shook his head, clearly frustrated. They had the lost look of visitors who had planned this moment for months, possibly years, only to find themselves confused by the layout of the palace grounds. The morning air carried the familiar sounds of London traffic from beyond the palace walls. But within the courtyard, an atmosphere of anticipation built steadily. Palace staff moved efficiently in the background, preparing for the ceremony that would soon begin. The guard commander conducted his final inspection, his practiced eye scanning each soldier for any imperfection in their appearance or stance. James had participated in this ceremony hundreds of times, but he never lost appreciation for its significance. Each movement was choreographed with military precision, every step measured and deliberate. The tourists might see it as entertainment, but for James and his fellow guardsmen, it represented a sacred duty passed down through generations of British soldiers. As he maintained his rigid posture, James reflected on the journey that had brought him here. His commanding officer had recommended him for the Guards based on his exemplary service record and unshakable composure under pressure. During his time in Afghanistan, James had demonstrated the kind of quick thinking and courage that the Guards valued above all else. He had saved 3 fellow soldiers during an improvised explosive device attack, earning him a commendation for bravery. The palace courtyard began to fill with the sound of approaching footsteps as the new guard marched into position. The band struck up a traditional military march, and James felt the familiar surge of pride that came with participating in a ceremony watched by millions around the world through broadcasts and photographs. But today would be different from all the others. Today, James Mitchell would face a situation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. A moment that would test not just his military discipline, but his fundamental humanity. The approaching ceremony would soon be overshadowed by events that would make headlines around the world and forever change how one young soldier viewed his duty to serve and protect. The clock tower chimed the quarter hour, and James tightened his grip on his rifle, unaware that in just a few minutes, his life would take a dramatic turn that would bring him face to face with members of the royal family under circumstances no one could have anticipated. The changing of the guard ceremony began with its usual pomp and precision. The band played stirring military march as the new guards marched in perfect formation across the courtyard. Tourists pressed closer to the railings, cameras clicking frantically as they tried to capture the spectacle. James maintained his stoic expression, eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. But his peripheral vision caught the movement and excitement of the crowd. Everything proceeded normally for the first 15 minutes. The guard commander barked orders in his crisp military tone, and the soldiers responded with movements sharp as clockwork. The tourists seemed mesmerized by the display, children pointing excitedly at the tall bearskin hats and scarlet uniforms. Then James heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the carefully orchestrated ceremony. A woman's voice, high-pitched with panic, crying out in what sounded like Italian. Aiuto, aiuto. Per favor. The desperation in her voice cut through the military music and ceremonial commands. Like a knife, training dictated that James should remain motionless, eyes forward, regardless of distractions. Guards were taught to ignore everything from aggressive tourists to unexpected weather. They were living statues, symbols of British resolve and discipline. Breaking formation during a ceremony was considered a serious breach of protocol that could end a military career, but the woman's cries grew more frantic, and James could see from the corner of his eye that something was terribly wrong. A small crowd had gathered near the palace gates, and people were pointing and shouting. The ceremonial music continued, but an undercurrent of real alarm was spreading through the tourist crowd. James risked a slight turn of his head and saw a scene that made his blood run cold. An elderly Italian woman had collapsed near the palace railings, her husband kneeling beside her in obvious panic. She appeared to be having some kind of medical emergency, her face pale and her breathing labored. The man was gesturing wildly, trying to communicate with English-speaking tourists. But the language barrier was preventing him from getting help. The woman looked to be in her 70s, dressed in a flowered dress and comfortable walking shoes that marked her as a tourist. Her husband, equally elderly, wore the expression of a man watching his world fall apart. They had probably saved for years to make this trip to London, and now their dream vacation was turning into a nightmare. James watched in growing horror as precious seconds ticked by. The other tourists seemed frozen, unsure of how to help. Some were taking photos with their phones, others were backing away nervously. A few tried to communicate with the distressed husband, but his limited English and their lack of Italian created a dangerous delay in getting proper assistance. The woman's condition was clearly deteriorating. James could see her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her breathing was becoming more shallow. His military training kicked in, recognizing the signs of a serious cardiac event. Every moment of delay could be the difference between life and death. The guard commander was still conducting the ceremony, apparently unaware of the emergency unfolding just meters away. The music played on, the other guards maintained their positions, and the formal changing of duties continued as if nothing unusual was happening. But James knew that without immediate intervention, he might be witnessing a preventable tragedy. His mind raced through the possibilities. Breaking formation would likely result in disciplinary action, possibly ending his career with the guards. He had worked so hard to earn this position, overcome so many obstacles to wear this uniform. His family back in Wales was so proud of his achievement. Was he willing to throw it all away for strangers? But as he watched the elderly woman struggling for breath while her husband pleaded desperately for help, James realized there was really no choice at all. His oath as a soldier was to protect people, and sometimes that meant protecting civilians. Even if it meant breaking protocol, the woman's husband looked directly at James, their eyes meeting across the courtyard. The old man's expression was pure desperation, a plea for help that transcended language barriers. In that moment, James saw his own grandfather's face, remembered his mother's stories about the tight-knit community, where neighbors helped neighbors without question. James made his decision. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward out of formation, knowing that his life was about to change forever. Behind him, he heard a sharp intake of breath from his fellow guards and a confused murmur from the crowd. The ceremonial music seemed to falter as musicians noticed the disruption, but James Mitchell was no longer thinking about military protocol or career consequences. He was thinking about an elderly woman who needed help, and a frightened husband who had traveled thousands of miles only to face his worst nightmare in a foreign country. James broke into a run, his heavy military boots echoing against the cobblestones as he rushed toward the palace gates. The crowd of tourists parted before him, startled by the sight of a Queen's Guard abandoning his post during the sacred ceremony. Behind him he could hear the guard commander shouting orders, but the words faded into background noise as James focused entirely on reaching the collapsed woman. He reached the elderly Italian couple within seconds, immediately dropping to his knees beside the unconscious woman. His military medical training kicked in as he quickly assessed her condition. Her pulse was weak and irregular, her breathing shallow and labored. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that James recognized as a sign of cardiac distress. "Sir, what's your wife's name?" James asked the panicked husband, switching to basic Italian phrases he had learned during a NATO training exercise years earlier. The man's eyes widened with relief at hearing his native language. "Maria," the husband replied, tears streaming down his weathered face. "She has a bad heart. We forgot her medicine at the hotel." His English was broken but understandable. His voice shaking with fear and exhaustion, James gently lifted Maria's wrist to check her pulse again while calling out to the crowd of onlookers. "Has someone called an ambulance?" Several tourists nodded, holding up their mobile phones. A young British woman pushed forward, identifying herself as a nurse, and knelt beside James to assist. Working together, James and the nurse carefully positioned Maria in the recovery position, ensuring her airway remained clear. James removed his heavy bearskin hat and placed it under her head as a cushion, then unbuttoned his tight collar to cool himself as he worked. The scarlet tunic that had been so perfectly pressed that morning was now wrinkled and dusty from kneeling on the pavement. The crowd around them grew larger as word spread of the emergency. Tourists from dozens of countries watched anxiously as the Queen's Guard provided medical assistance, many recording the unprecedented scene with their cameras. The ceremonial music had stopped completely now, and even the other guards had broken their rigid postures to observe the unfolding drama. Maria's husband, whose name James learned was Giuseppe, held his wife's hand while providing what medical information he could remember. They had been married for 52 years, he explained, and this trip to London was a celebration of their anniversary. Maria had always dreamed of seeing Buckingham Palace, and Giuseppe had saved for 3 years to make the journey possible. James felt his heart clench at the old man's words. This couple had traveled so far and planned so carefully for what should have been a joyful experience. Instead, they were facing a medical crisis far from home, surrounded by strangers in a country where they barely spoke the language. "The ambulance is coming," the British nurse assured everyone, her professional calm helping to settle the anxious crowd. She had checked Maria's vital signs and agreed with James's assessment that they were dealing with a serious cardiac event, but one that could be managed if they received proper medical attention quickly. As they waited for emergency services, James found himself talking to Maria in a gentle voice, using a mixture of English and Italian words to encourage her. He had read somewhere that unconscious patients could sometimes hear voices around them, and he wanted her to know she wasn't alone. Giuseppe gripped his wife's other hand, whispering prayers in Italian, while tears continued to roll down his cheeks. The wailing of sirens grew louder as the ambulance approached through London traffic. James could see palace security guards speaking urgently into their radios, and he knew that his breach of protocol was being reported up the chain of command. Part of his mind worried about the consequences he would face, but a larger part felt absolute certainty that he had done the right thing. The crowd of tourists had formed a protective circle around the scene, giving the medical emergency space while showing their support for the dramatic rescue effort. Many were visibly moved by watching a Queen's Guard abandon ceremony and protocol to help strangers in need. Some wiped away tears as they witnessed Giuseppe's devotion to his wife and James's compassionate response. As the ambulance pulled up to the palace gates, James helped the paramedics transfer Maria to a stretcher. Her color was improving slightly, and she had begun to show signs of returning consciousness. The lead paramedic, an experienced woman in her 40s, complimented James on his quick thinking and proper medical response. "You may have saved her life," she told him quietly as they loaded Maria into the ambulance. Another few minutes' delay, and this could have been much worse. Giuseppe grasped James's hands before climbing into the ambulance with his wife. "Grazie, grazie mille," he repeated, his eyes bright with gratitude. "You are an angel sent by God." James felt a lump in his throat as the elderly man blessed him in Italian. Before the ambulance doors closed, as the emergency vehicle pulled away with its sirens wailing, James suddenly became aware of the hundreds of eyes watching him. The ceremony had completely stopped. Tourists were applauding spontaneously, and palace staff were approaching with serious expressions. Most importantly, he noticed a group of well-dressed individuals watching from a palace balcony, and his heart nearly stopped when he realized who they were. Standing on the palace balcony watching the entire rescue unfold were members of the royal family themselves. James felt his stomach drop as he recognized the unmistakable figures of Prince William and Catherine, along with two of their children who had apparently been enjoying a morning view of the ceremony from their private vantage point. The prince and princess had witnessed everything, James breaking formation, rushing to help the collapsed tourist, providing medical assistance, and coordinating with emergency services. They had seen a Queen's Guard abandon centuries of military protocol to save a stranger's life. James wondered if this would be the final nail in the coffin of his military career. The guard commander approached James with a stern expression, flanked by two palace security officers. The ceremonial changing of the guard had been completely abandoned, and tourists were still milling about in excitement, many sharing photos and videos of the dramatic rescue on their social media accounts. "Sergeant Mitchell," the commander said in a voice that carried across the courtyard, "you will report to the guard room immediately for debriefing." His tone was neutral, giving no indication of whether James was about to face disciplinary action or commendation. As James retrieved his bearskin hat and began to march toward the palace entrance, he noticed something unexpected. The tourists weren't just taking pictures, they were applauding. A spontaneous round of applause had broken out among the hundreds of visitors who had witnessed his actions. Children were pointing at him excitedly, and adults were nodding their approval. Several people called out, "Well done," and "Hero," in various languages. Even more surprising was the reaction of his fellow guards. As James passed them, several broke their rigid postures long enough to give him subtle nods of approval. These men understood military discipline as well as anyone. But they also understood something more fundamental, the duty to help others in need, inside the palace. James was escorted through corridors he had never seen before, past priceless artwork and historical artifacts that spoke of centuries of British royal tradition. His mind raced as he tried to prepare for what awaited him. Would he be court-martialed? Dismissed from service? His family back in Wales would be devastated if his military career ended in disgrace. The guard room was a formal space with dark wood paneling and portraits of previous guard commanders dating back generations. James stood at attention as the commander reviewed the incident report that had been hastily prepared by palace security. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. "Sergeant Mitchell," the commander began, his voice grave, "what you did today was a serious breach of protocol. The Queen's Guard does not break formation during ceremony under any circumstances. This tradition has been maintained for centuries, and it exists for important security and ceremonial reasons." James felt his heart sink, but he maintained his military bearing. "Yes, sir. I understand the seriousness of my actions." "Sir, however," the commander continued, and James detected a slight change in his tone, "there are circumstances that transcend even the most sacred protocols. What you did today demonstrated the true spirit of service that the guards are meant to embody. You saw someone in desperate need and responded with courage and compassion." Before James could fully process these words, there was a soft knock at the door. A palace aide entered and whispered something to the commander, whose eyebrows rose in surprise. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "it appears that your actions today have been noticed at the highest levels. You are requested to present yourself for a brief audience." James felt dizzy as he was led through more corridors to an elegant sitting room with windows overlooking the palace gardens. Standing near the window, dressed casually but unmistakably regal, was Prince William. The future King of England turned as James entered and was announced. "Sergeant Mitchell," Prince William said with a warm smile, "my wife and I witnessed your actions today from the balcony. We wanted to thank you personally for what you did." James stammered out a response about simply doing his duty, but the prince waved away his modesty. "What you did went far beyond duty. You showed exactly the kind of courage and humanity that makes me proud to be British. That elderly couple will remember your kindness for the rest of their lives." Princess Catherine joined them, carrying a tea service that she set down with her own hands. "We've been following the situation," she said gently. "The hospital called to let us know that Maria is stable and expected to make a full recovery. Her husband specifically asked them to thank the angel soldier who saved his wife's life." James felt overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the conversation. Here he was, still in his dusty and wrinkled ceremonial uniform, being served tea by the future Queen of England, while being praised for actions he had feared would end his career. Prince William continued, "We understand that military protocol is important, but we also believe that sometimes the greater good requires us to look beyond rules and regulations. Today you showed judgment, courage, and compassion that reflect the very best of British values." The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with the royal couple asking about James's background, his family, and his military service. They seemed genuinely interested in his story and impressed by his dedication to service. When they learned about his mother's pride in his achievement, Princess Catherine smiled warmly and asked if she might write a personal note to thank her for raising such a fine son. The news of James's heroic actions spread like wildfire beyond the palace gates. Within hours, videos and photographs of the Queen's Guard breaking formation to save a tourist had gone viral on social media platforms around the world. News outlets from London to Tokyo were running the story. Praising the soldier who put humanity above protocol, the headlines were overwhelmingly positive. "British Guards' act of heroism captures hearts worldwide," read the BBC website. The Times of London featured a front-page story titled, "The True Spirit of Service." International media picked up the story with equal enthusiasm, with papers in Rome calling James "L'Angelo di Londra," the Angel of London. Giuseppe and Maria's story added another layer of human interest to the coverage. Journalists discovered that the elderly couple had indeed saved for 3 years to afford their dream trip to London. Giuseppe worked as a retired postman, and Maria had been a seamstress their entire married life. Their modest savings had been carefully planned to cover their anniversary celebration, and the trip represented the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. From her hospital bed, Maria gave an interview to Italian television, praising the young soldier who had appeared like an angel when she needed help most. Giuseppe, sitting beside her holding her hand, became emotional as he described watching James abandon his ceremonial duties to rush to their aid. "In that moment, I saw the best of humanity," he told reporters in Italian. This young man risked his career to save a stranger's life. The hospital reported that Maria's condition had stabilized completely. Her cardiac episode had been triggered by a combination of excitement, heat, and forgotten medication, but the quick response had prevented any lasting damage. Doctors confirmed that the delay of even a few more minutes could have had serious consequences, making James's intervention genuinely life-saving. Back at the palace, James found himself dealing with unprecedented attention. His fellow guards treated him as something of a celebrity, though they good-naturedly teased him about becoming famous for the world's most expensive first aid course. The guard commander informed him that he had received calls from military brass, government officials, and even international dignitaries praising his actions. More surprisingly, James began receiving letters and emails from around the world. A school class in Australia had written to thank him for showing that soldiers care about people. A veterans organization in Canada sent a letter praising his demonstration of military values. Children from a dozen countries had drawn pictures of him helping the elderly woman, their artwork depicting him as a real-life superhero in a red uniform. The most touching correspondence came from Giuseppe and Maria themselves. Once, Maria was well enough to leave the hospital. The couple sent a handwritten letter to the palace, addressed simply to the angel soldier. Giuseppe had written in careful English about how James's kindness had restored their faith in humanity and made their anniversary trip even more meaningful than they had imagined. 3 days after the incident, James received an unexpected invitation. The royal family had arranged for Giuseppe and Maria to return to the palace for a proper tour, and they had specifically requested that James be present if possible. When the elderly couple arrived, Maria was walking slowly but steadily, her color fully restored and her spirits obviously high. The reunion in the palace gardens was emotional for everyone present. Maria embraced James like a grandmother greeting a beloved grandchild, tears streaming down her face as she thanked him in a mixture of Italian and English. Giuseppe shook his hand firmly, then surprised everyone by saluting the young soldier with obvious respect and gratitude. Princess Catherine had arranged for afternoon tea to be served in the garden, creating an intimate setting where the unlikely group could share their experiences. Giuseppe and Maria presented James with a small gift, a hand-carved wooden cross that had belonged to Giuseppe's father, a gesture that moved James to tears despite his military training and emotional control. During their visit, Maria shared something that hadn't been reported in the media. She revealed that in the moments when she was losing consciousness, she had prayed for help, asking God to send someone to take care of Giuseppe if something happened to her. When she regained awareness in the hospital and learned about James's intervention, she was convinced that her prayer had been answered. The couple's 3-day extended stay in London became a celebration rather than a medical crisis. The story of their rescue had touched so many people that local businesses began offering them free meals, tours, and experiences. The hotel where they were staying upgraded them to a suite at no charge. Strangers approached them on the street to wish Maria well and praise James's actions. For James, the experience was transformative in ways he hadn't expected. He had joined the military to escape his small Welsh mining town and build a better life, but he had discovered something much more valuable than career advancement. He had learned that true honor came not from following rules blindly, but from having the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. The incident had also attracted attention from military leadership in ways that surprised him. Rather than facing disciplinary action, James found himself being considered for commendations and leadership roles. Senior officers noted that his quick thinking, medical skills, and moral courage represented exactly the qualities the modern military needed in its non-commissioned officers. 6 months after that transformative morning at Buckingham Palace, James Mitchell found himself standing in the same courtyard where his life had changed forever. But this time, he wasn't wearing the red tunic of a Queen's Guard. Instead, he wore the dress uniform of a newly promoted color sergeant, with additional insignia recognizing his award for exceptional service to the community. The ceremony taking place was special, organized specifically to honor James's actions and their lasting impact. Giuseppe and Maria had returned to London, this time as guests of honor at an official recognition ceremony. Maria looked radiant and healthy, walking confidently beside her devoted husband who beamed with pride at being part of such an important occasion. The months following the rescue had brought changes James could never have anticipated. His story had inspired military personnel around the world, leading to discussions about the balance between protocol and human compassion in training programs. Several military academies had begun using his case as an example of moral courage and leadership education. More personally, James had received the Queen's Commendation for Brave Conduct, one of the highest civilian honors that could be awarded to military personnel. The citation specifically mentioned his exceptional courage in placing human life above military protocol, demonstrating the finest traditions of British service and compassion. The award ceremony was attended by Prince William and Princess Catherine, who had become genuine admirers of James's character and service. They had followed his story closely, learning about his promotion and his new role training other guardsmen. The prince had personally recommended James for advanced leadership training, recognizing qualities that would serve the military well in future roles. Giuseppe and Maria had become unlikely celebrities in their hometown in Italy. Their local newspaper had featured their story prominently, and Giuseppe had been invited to speak at schools about the kindness of strangers and the importance of international friendship. Maria had fully recovered from her cardiac episode and was healthier than she had been in years, partly due to improved medical monitoring inspired by their London experience. The couple had maintained correspondence with James throughout the months, sending photographs of their daily life and updates about their health. Maria had knitted him a scarf in the colors of the Welsh flag, while Giuseppe had researched James's hometown and sent him historical postcards and local delicacies from Italy. During the recognition ceremony, Giuseppe addressed the gathered audience in carefully practiced English. His words were simple but profound as he described the moment when James had broken formation to help them. "In my long life," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "I have learned that true nobility has nothing to do with titles or uniforms. It comes from the heart of a person who sees suffering and chooses to act." Maria added her own words in Italian, which were translated for the audience. She spoke about how James's kindness had given her not just physical life, but renewed faith in the goodness of humanity. Their anniversary trip, which had begun as a celebration of their marriage, had become something much more significant, a testament to the connections that could form between strangers when compassion overcame barriers. The ceremony concluded with James being presented with a special commemoration from the Italian government, recognizing his service to their citizens. The Italian ambassador to Britain spoke about how individual acts of kindness could strengthen international relationships and serve as examples of the best qualities shared by all nations. For James personally, the recognition was gratifying, but the real reward had been the experience itself and its aftermath. His relationship with his family in Wales had deepened as they saw their son and brother celebrated not just for military achievement, but for moral courage. His mother, Margaret, had framed every newspaper article about her son, creating a shrine to his heroism that embarrassed and touched him equally. The incident had also changed James's perspective on his military career. He had begun working with military counselors and chaplains, helping to develop protocols for situations where humanitarian concerns might conflict with standard procedures. His experience had contributed to updated training that emphasized critical thinking and moral reasoning alongside traditional military discipline. Giuseppe and Maria's final gift to James was perhaps the most meaningful. They had arranged for a small olive tree to be planted in the palace gardens, with a discreet plaque recognizing the friendship that had grown from a moment of crisis. The tree would serve as a living reminder that kindness planted in foreign soil could grow into something beautiful and lasting. As the ceremony ended and the various dignitaries departed, James found himself alone with Giuseppe and Maria for a few precious minutes. The elderly couple embraced him one final time, and Giuseppe pressed something into his hand, a small medallion of St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers, to protect him on whatever journeys lay ahead in his military career. Walking back through the palace corridors that had once seemed so intimidating, James reflected on how a single moment of choosing compassion over protocol had changed not just his life, but the lives of others around the world. His story continued to inspire letters from young people considering military service, parents teaching their children about moral courage, and fellow soldiers who faced their own moments of difficult decision-making. James Mitchell had learned that true heroism wasn't about following orders blindly or maintaining perfect formation. It was about having the wisdom to know when humanity mattered more than protocol, and the courage to act on that knowledge regardless of the consequences. His moment of stepping out of formation had led him to step into a larger understanding of what it meant to serve others with honor,